32. And then the other passage is from Genesis 50, and that has to do with Joseph meeting up with his brothers again, and they come to him in need of help. So Genesis 32, 22 through 33:11. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor with my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want." So he urged him, and he took it. And then we move on to Joseph. Joseph's brothers, of course, sold him as a slave, and he went through all of that stuff he went through to become right-hand man to the Pharaoh, basically. And then there was a famine, and Joseph's brothers came to him. They've already met, and this is like a second meeting. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he's doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. I have an older brother That's not what I want. I have an older brother and an older sister. I do know who I do know who is in my family. I have an older sister and a younger brother. We are 3 kids born in 3 years minus 4 days.
Wow.
Yes. I have one photo of my sis and I that's on the front of the cover when I was just old enough to sit up. And I think maybe I was just propped up against her. I'm grinning this big old grin for the photographer.
It's perfect.
And my sis, on the other hand, was looking pretty put out about the whole thing. I'd say she was sulking even. And then my brother came along. And as far as I know, there's no photos of us as little tiny kids. With 3 kids, it always seemed, though, that it was 2 against 1, and it was seldom the same 2 against the 1. I'm not sure about this, but I think that being the middle child, I was always one of the 2. I don't ever remember being the 1. I could have been, but I don't remember. But I just think this picture is very telling.
It's perfect.
My sister was not happy. She had to be potty trained before I was born. My mother insisted on that. So, yeah, I don't think she was happy with me. If you all have siblings, how did you all get along as you grew up? There was a Facebook meme yesterday that said, "My mother didn't raise no fool, and if she did, it was my brother." The book of Genesis is full of stories of brothers and sisters in competition and conflict. First of all, we have the tragic story of Cain and Abel. Then we have the story of Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was Abraham's first son, born to his wife Sarah's Egyptian slave, Hagar. And according to the story, there was a bitter rivalry between the 2 mothers and their 2 sons. Hagar and Ishmael were treated horribly, while Sarah and Isaac were given every advantage. God intervened and made it clear that even if Abraham and Sarah failed to love Hagar and Ishmael, God cared for them deeply. Years later, then, we have Abraham's grandson, Jacob, who was caught up in a bitter sibling rivalry with his older twin brother, Esau. At the heart of their conflict was the belief that God favored Jacob over Esau. Believing he was favored by God, Jacob felt entitled to take advantage of Esau, and he seemed to get away with his trickery again and again. We remember how he took Esau's birthright and his blessing. Eventually, Jacob had to flee home because of Esau's anger. And for many years, the 2 brothers lived far apart, maturing, yet still feeling alienated from one another. During this time, we know that Jacob married 2 sisters, a favored one named Rachel, and the less favored one named Leah, the older sister. Leah became the mother of 6 of Jacob's 12 sons, so her story had a happier ending than anyone expected. After Jacob became a rich and successful man, he began a homeward journey. And along the way, he discovered that the next day he was going to be forced to encounter his brother who was coming to him, this brother that he had wronged in so many ways so many years before. Just imagine how afraid Jacob might have felt. He'd lived his whole life by trickery, even tricking his father-in-law, the father of his 2 wives. He was good at tricking people. His old tricks weren't going to work anymore, though, so all night long it was as if he was wrestling with God. His long night of wrestling might remind you of some night when you struggled to sleep because of some major event happening the next day. A doctor's appointment, surgery, IRS audit, meeting with the school principal. Like Jacob, we wrestle to get our way or to get out of doing something. We grapple with changing habits, even when those habits don't work well anymore. Like Jacob, we wrestle in the night, maybe held in a headlock of despair or fear, thinking it's too late to try something else, to try a new way. So hour after hour through the night, Jacob wrestled. When the new day came, he arose from the struggle with 2 signs of his emergence into a new maturity as a human being. First, he received the blessing of a new name, Israel, which means God wrestler, and he received a hip injury that required him to walk with a limp, a lifelong memento of his long night of struggle. Jacob was now ready, though limping, to face his brother. And instead of trying to trick Esau, as the old Jacob would have done, he sent Esau a huge array of gifts to honor him. And when Jacob finally met his brother face to face, Esau had his chance to finally get revenge for all the dirty tricks that Jacob pulled in the past. And Esau surprised everyone. He made it clear that he wasn't holding a grudge. He wanted no revenge. He didn't require any gifts. He simply wanted to be reconciled with his brother. And Jacob was so touched that he said these beautiful words, "Truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such grace." The upstart trickster had finally learned to see the face of God in the face of one he formerly tricked and despised. He discovered God's grace in the one that he'd always thought of as disgraced, less than. In the face of the one that he assumed was not favored by God, God had been revealed. What a story this is for us. My sister and I are not getting along right now. This story really speaks to me right now.
Where is she?
She's in Arizona. We have differing political views, which were which have been very uncomfortable. So, even though Jacob learned an important lesson that day, sibling rivalry had a resurgence in the next generation. Jacob had 12 sons. One son, Joseph, was resented by his 11 brothers because, as with Abel and Cain, Sarah over Hagar, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and Rachel over Leah before him, Joseph was a favored sibling. Remember, Joseph had that dream he unwisely shared with his brothers about them groveling before him? Probably not a very wise decision on his part to share it. Well, eventually, driven by their resentment toward Joseph, we know the brothers plotted to kill him. And at the last minute, they decided to sell him as a slave to some Egyptian traders in the area. Through a dramatic series of temptations, delays, setbacks, and recoveries, Joseph rose from slavery to a place of honor in the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh. Many years later, when a famine sent the brothers to Egypt as refugees, Joseph had his chance, just as Esau did. He could get revenge on those miserable brothers who treated him so badly. He could do to them what they had done to him. Joseph, like Esau, though, made a different choice, not for revenge, but for forgiveness. When his brothers did grovel in front of him, just like his boyhood dream anticipated, and when they offered to be treated as slaves rather than brothers, Joseph didn't gloat. He refused to play God. He refused to judge them evil. He refused to sentence them to death or enslavement. Instead, he reinterpreted the whole story of their relationship. Their evil intent had been overshadowed by God's good intent, so Joseph could save their lives. He had suffered, and he had been blessed. He realized for their benefit. So instead of imitating their resentful and violent example, he imitated the gracious heart of God by refusing to play God. That's a God with a little g. He became the image of God, the big G, by showing kindness to them. Now, I discovered a book titled The Kindness of God by a Catholic theologian and philosopher named Janet Soskis. She examined the etymology of the word kindness. Soskis understands kindness as a strong virtue rather than a weak one. In Middle English, she writes, the words kind and kin were the same. To say that Christ is our kind Lord is not to say that Christ is tender and gentle, although that might be implied, but it's to say that Jesus is our kin, our kind. Peeling the sentimental layers off of the idea of kindness, we can replace them with this fact. To be kind meant to be kin. God's kindness meant precisely that. It meant that God became our kin, Jesus our brother, and this, Suska said, was a foundational truth about who we are. Not only that, but for speakers of Middle English, Lord had a particular meaning. A lord was someone from the nobility, the upper social classes, so to say our kind Lord was to say the difference in social or economic status between peasants and nobility was also erased through Jesus the Lord being of the same kind as all, landowners and peasants alike. Jesus erased divisions that privileged some people over others. I found that interesting study of the etymology of the word. If Suskas is right, then practicing kindness requires at minimum a willingness to see the image of God in and to find a point of honest connection with every person, even and especially those I dislike. In this way, Joseph, the victim of mistreatment by his brothers, became the hero. The one the brothers cruelly rejected was the one whose kindness they needed. The one who was considered favored wasn't made superior so others could grovel before him. He was made strong so that he could serve them. In both of these stories of sibling rivalry, the rejected brother, the other brother, is the one in whose face the grace of God shines brightly. In Brian McLaren's book, We Make the Road by Walking. Have you looked at that? Have you seen that book yet? We Make the Road by Walking. Brian McLaren says that these stories pulsate with some of the most powerful and radical themes of the Bible. Blessing, power, or favor is not given for privilege over others, but for service for the benefit of others. The weaker brother or sister, the one who is deemed ugly or dull or disfavored or illegitimate, is always beloved by God. From Abel to Ishmael, to Hagar, to Esau, to Leah, to Joseph, God keeps showing up, not in winners who have defeated or exploited or rejected a weaker rival, but in the weaker ones who have been defeated or rejected. McLaren also says, these same themes are the heartbeat of two of Jesus' greatest parables. In the parable of the prodigal son, also known as the parable of the forgiving father, the father who runs out to welcome his runaway younger son behaves exactly like Esau did, running to him, embracing him, kissing him, showing grace rather than retaliation. And he acted just as Joseph did as well, not making the runaway grovel as a slave. He welcomed him as a beloved member of the family. And also in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it was the disfavored Samaritan, not the high-status priest or Levite, who models the love of God. So what can we learn from the biblical examples of brothers and sisters? There are a few principles that we can apply to any relationship, especially to brothers and sisters. But if we're all in the family of Christ, it's everyone around us. First of all, we are to love others in a way that reflects the love of Christ. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. It's 1 John 4, 7 and 8. Second principle is we are to show kindness to each other, treating those around us the way we want to be treated. In Ephesians 4:32 says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. And Luke 6:31 says, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." This means that we should not only respond gracefully in the face of our siblings, in the face of their anger or their accusations, but also go out of the way to serve them. John 13:12-14 says, this is Jesus, after he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had reclined again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of others." And then finally, Paul instructed believers to live at peace with everyone. In Romans 12:18 it says, "If it is possible," that's the kicker right there, "if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all, avoiding arguments and conflict and playing the role of peacemaker when disagreements arise within our families." As in Genesis, life today is full of rivalries and conflicts. And especially in the United States right now, we have so many divisions and quarrels. We all experience wrongs and hurts and injustices through the actions of others. And we all inflict wrongs, hurts, and injustices upon others. If we want to reflect the image of God, we will choose grace over hostility, reconciliation over revenge, and equality over rivalry. When we make those choices, we encounter God in the face of our former rivals and enemies. And as we surrender to God and seek to be reconciled with others, our faces too reflect the face of God. For sure, we come alive as God's image bearers. Amen.